All right, what's going on, everybody? Happy Saturday night. So earlier today, I did some filming of some city skyline stuff, and I'm really excited about that stuff just because obviously I really enjoy the game. But again, trying to build a little bit of culture here. Trying to find, people who are like-minded, who are interested in gaming and PC building and stuff like that. People who are maybe on the more conservative side, or people who are on, maybe the other side of the aisle, but are willing to at least listen to ideas and learn a little bit, and hopefully be able to find some common ground, maybe outside the political discussion. And what I really want to do is try and take some of the animosity out of the discussion and figure out if there's areas where we can, find common ground that just have nothing to do with politics. And while at the same time still being able to convey our political ideas to each other. But rather than immediately ascribing, ill will or malintent to people, I'm hoping that some of these other kind of cultural elements can come in there, and rather than just bashing the other side and, claiming that the other side is characterized by a certain, set of really awful things, maybe we can see that we're actually just normal people and we just kind of have different opinions, and it's okay to talk about them. So that was kind of a long intro. The intro is actually still continuing. But today is a really special day, night, or whatever, because I have finished all 3 volumes. Can you see it? I have finished all 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago. I finished the last couple pages of the 3rd volume this morning, right when I woke up. And these books are incredibly eye-opening. I really encourage everyone to read them. But as you know, on this channel, we've been going through, and I've gone through all the books and I've highlighted parts that I think are important. I star certain things that I think are important, and I like to come on here and read them to you. So tonight in this video, we're going to continue with going through volume 1, and my hope is to get through, all 3 volumes on this channel. And I think I'm going to pick up the pace on creating these videos, in addition to creating other videos. So without droning on through the intro, I'm going to go ahead and just start reading some more parts from this. And I just realized, so I know that I'm going to get really involved in the intro, and this is going to end up being a longer video than I expect, but I just want to say this one last thought. So, locals. I really badly want to create content for locals. The problem is that I have a limitation with bandwidth and number of videos that I can upload, etc. on locals. And I really like to record these videos in 4K. Although for these specific videos, I was thinking about doing them 1080p, but I accidentally started the webcam in 4K already, so this one's just going to be in 4K. But what happens when I do 4K is I have to break up the videos into such small increments, basically into 1 gigabyte increments, so I can get like 10 videos. I suppose I could do half gigabyte increments, but if I was to do that with some of the, city skyline stuff, I'd only be able to upload like, let's say I uploaded 10 videos a gigabyte each, that would only be like 4 minutes each. Or less than that, maybe even closer to like a minute or 2 minutes, because I want it to be high quality. Anyway, I want to put more content on locals. I'm going to render all these videos in a lower resolution so that I can put them up on locals too. Nice thing about locals is it's a little bit more free speech oriented, but then the bummer is there's all these technical administrative issues. So I'm hoping that if I post enough content on locals, I think that maximum of 10 gigs or whatever goes up. But that also depends, I think, also on your popularity on locals. And I'm not really sure if anyone's paying attention to the locals channel at all, or even the YouTube channel, because I haven't posted in a really long time. So anyway, you can catch this particular video is going to be on locals too in its entirety. And depending on how as I get back into this, I might start doing a thing where I do a lot more in-depth commentary on these texts on locals, and then I just like cut out certain parts to put on YouTube. I know I talked about that, doing that before on the channel, and honestly just haven't been following through with making videos, and I want to change that. I want to get back into it. So let's go ahead and read some more stuff from the Gulag Archipelago. So this chapter right here is called First Cell, First Love, and it's a really interesting chapter because Solzhenitsyn is basically describing his very first, Soviet prison cell after he was taken into the Gulag labor camps. And what's interesting about this is throughout the beginning of this chapter, we're gonna read a little bit further in than just the very beginning, but why does he say first love? Well, obviously, when you were taken in for interrogation and stuff like that, typically, you were held in, similar to solitary confinement type cells. Usually you were tortured. Generally, the only person that you spoke to was, the interrogator, who's also a Soviet informer, and would generally try and coax you or force you into signing a admission that you were guilty of some random political crime. And we've talked about this before. A lot of those political crimes were very simply speech-related or thought-related crimes. And generally, it was because somebody denounced you without really knowing the full context of what you said, or maybe they were envious of you, etc. Anyway, so he describes the cell as his first love because it's the first point in your Gulag prison experience where you actually are interacting with other people that are in your same situation. And so a lot of this chapter is him telling stories about the people who he interacted with, and then of course adding in his own evaluation of his experience as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Among our many lost values, there is one more: the high worth of those people who spoke and wrote Russian before us. It is odd that they are almost undescribed in our pre-revolutionary literature. Only very rarely do we feel their breath from Marina Tsvetaeva or from Mother Maria in her recollections of Bloch. They saw too much to settle on any one thing. They reached toward the sublime too fervently to stand firmly on the earth. Before societies fall, just such a stratum of wise-thinking people emerges, people who are that and nothing more. And how they were laughed at, how they were mocked, as though they stuck in the craw of people whose deeds and actions were single-minded and narrow-minded. And the only nickname they were christened with was, quote, rot, unquote, because these people were a flower that bloomed too soon and breathed too delicate a fragrance, and so they were mowed down. These people were particularly helpless in their personal lives. They could neither bend with the wind nor pretend nor get by. Every word declared an opinion, a passion, a protest. And it was just such people the mowing machine cut down, just such people the chaff cutter shredded. So this is an example. The reason why I wanted to read this particular passage, and now we're going to skip ahead, is because this is a perfect example of how dissent is typically crushed in, these post-socialist revolutionary times. And one of the big things, which maybe an upcoming quote we'll discuss in here, is how, the Russian Revolution was really a response to the Tsarist prison system, and the Tsar is similar to a king, and it was perceived to be, tyrannical in nature. And one thing is, one of the opinions or historical things that you were not supposed to express in post-revolutionary times, which was considered counter-revolutionary, was to actually talk about how much nicer the Tsarist prison system and justice system was as compared to the post-revolutionary communist Soviet justice system. And so that's why Solzhenitsyn talks about how there are these people who would speak out ahead of time, and they were the first people that the revolution needed to get rid of, essentially. And if you kind of reflect on current events, you can see why a book like this is so dangerous to. I say dangerous. It's so dangerous to read and to understand. Skipping ahead here a little bit. So here's Solzhenitsyn. He meets a person named I can't remember the first name, but his last name is Festenko. And Festenko is actually somebody who knew Lenin personally. So Lenin being, if I'm not mistaken, the first kind of like official Soviet leader in Russia after the revolution. And of course, Lenin would call himself a revolutionary. So this guy Festenko was technically a revolutionary with Lenin, but he was more on the socialist democrat side, which is these people were in favor of getting rid of the Tsar, but not really in favor of like full-blown communism. And then there was like the Lenin side, which wanted full-blown communism. And there was the first revolution where they overthrew the Tsar, but then there was a second revolution where the full-blown communists basically just massacred all of the socialist democrats, as they call them here. Just because I mentioned that term, I'm not really sure how you would correlate that with what is called democratic socialists now. I think those terms, definitely refer to very different politics at that time. But to be honest with you, I personally am not knowledgeable enough about the history, even after reading this book, to really differentiate them from you. But it's a good thing to look up, a good thing to understand. I should probably look it up. Anyway, there was much about Festenko I could not yet understand. In my eyes, perhaps the main thing about him, and yet the most surprising, was that he had known Lenin personally. Yet he was quite cool in recalling this. Such was my attitude at the time that when someone in the cell called Festenko by his patronymic alone, without using his given name, in other words, Ilyich, asking, "Ilyich, is it your turn to take out the latrine bucket?" I was utterly outraged and offended because it seemed sacrilege to me not only to use Lenin's patronymic in the same sentence as latrine bucket, but even to call anyone on earth Ilyich except that one man, Lenin. For this reason, no doubt, there was much that Festenko would have liked to explain to me that he still could not bring himself to. Nonetheless, he did say to me in the clearest Russian, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," but I failed to understand him. Observing my enthusiasm, he more than once said to me insistently, "You are a mathematician. It's a mistake for you to forget that maximum of Descartes. Question everything. Question everything." What did this mean, everything? Certainly not everything. It seemed to me that I had questioned enough things as it was, and that was enough of that. Or, he said, hardly any of the old, hard labor political prisoners of the Tsarist times are left. I am one of the last. All the hard labor politicals have been destroyed, and then even dissolved. Sorry, let me restart that sentence. All the hard labor politicals have been destroyed, and they even dissolved our society in the 30s. Why, I asked, so we would not get together and discuss things. And I did want to go back a page and read this footnote, because I think that this is an interesting footnote right here, number 10 in this chapter. Soon after Festenko returned to the motherland, he was followed by a Canadian acquaintance, a former sailor on the battleship Potemkin, one of the mutineers, in fact, who had escaped to Canada and became a well-to-do farmer there. This former Potemkin sailor sold everything he owned, his farm and cattle, and returned to his native region with his money and his new tractor to help build sacred socialism. He enlisted in one of the first agricultural communes and donated his tractor to it. The tractor was driven any which way by whoever happened along and was quickly ruined. And the former Potemkin sailor saw things turning out very differently from the way he had pictured them for 20 years. Those in charge were incompetent. issuing orders that any sensible farmer could see were wild nonsense. In addition, he became skinnier and skinnier, and his clothes wore out, and nothing was left of the Canadian dollars he had exchanged for paper rubles. He begged to be allowed to leave with his family, and he crossed the border as poor as when he fled from the Potemkin. He crossed the ocean just as he had done then, working his way as a sailor. Because he had no money for passages, and back in Canada, working his way as a sailor because he had no money for passages, and back in Canada he began a life all over again as a hired hand on a farm. So, typically, I just think this is interesting because, there are a lot of things that are promised by certain political ideologies, and this is just a quick little anecdote of how they really end up working out. He buys this tractor, and then he donates this tractor to the commune, and now there's no concept of personal property, right? So it's the community's thing. In fact, it's not even right to say that it belongs to the community. It's just a thing that's there that anyone can use whenever they want, however they want. And, they broke his tractor, and then he almost starved to death and had to go home. So... And I just want to go back to this quote that I read earlier. The fact that, again, as I had mentioned, all the people who knew about the Tsarist prison system and justice system, they had to get rid of all those people. Otherwise, the truth about them would come out that the Soviet justice system and prison system was actually far more brutal, and was leading to many, many more difficulties for the very people that the revolutionaries claimed they wanted to help. So skipping ahead a little bit more, and this is going to be somewhat of a longer section because I actually want to read this story about a person who Solzhenitsyn met almost in its entirety. So what we're going to do is start at the very bottom of this page. And again, remember, this chapter is not only about Solzhenitsyn's experience in his first cell, but it's also about the people that he met. And this person who he met was actually apparently an engineer. And obviously, since I'm an engineer, this chapter, and there's going to be a lot more chapters like this coming up, I really identified with this. And, let me say, I didn't identify with this specific story about an engineer. You'll see why in a second. But basically what happened is, and hopefully I'm remembering this correctly, but the first people to kind of succumb to this prison system were the kulaks. They were really peasant farmers, but because they owned some kind of means of production, food production, they were considered bourgeois, simply because they were some of the most successful farmers. Anyway, they were all imprisoned because, bourgeois stuff is bad. They let the, apparent proletariat take over the farms. Of course, the original revolutionaries became the people who were really high ranked up. So then all the farm goods went straight up to them, and they siphoned their bit off the top and then distributed the rest. And there wasn't enough for everybody. Everyone starved. Anyway, the second group of people, or third people to get arrested, were all of the original engineers. And the reason why, which we'll definitely get into further in the book, is that typically when a 5-year plan was issued or a government plan was issued, it was considered anti-Soviet to, or counter-revolutionary to question the legitimacy of that plan, but not just to question the legitimacy of it, to openly express ideas that maybe this plan couldn't possibly work with the tools, resources, and manpower available, or perhaps there just wasn't technology that existed to do this, and they would have to invent technology, and it was considered counter-revolutionary to bring any of that stuff up. So they just, arrested all the engineers and then put in place like kind of government-trained engineers, and it's going to talk about this here. So let's go ahead and get started on this. So at the very bottom of the page, we introduced ourselves, and it turned out that LVZ, this person's name is, blocked out. I'm just going to call him Zebra. Is that the NATO phonetic alphabet for Z? I think so. Anyway, it turned out that LV Zebra was even younger than he appeared. He would be 36 that year. If they don't shoot me. Even more surprisingly, it developed that he was not a general at all, not even a colonel, and not even a military man, but an engineer. An engineer? I had grown up among engineers, and I could remember the engineers of the 20s very well indeed. Their open, shining intellects, their free and gentle humor, their agility and breadth of thought, the ease with which they shifted from one engineering field to another, and for that matter, from technology to social concerns and art. Then, too, they personified good manners and delicacy of taste, well-bred speech that flowed evenly and was free of uncultured words. One of them might play a musical instrument, another dabble in painting, and their faces always bore a spiritual imprint. Well, that's a really nice thing to say about engineers. Too bad this one that he's talking about is kind of sketchy, so let's go on. From the beginning of the 30s, I had lost contact with that milieu. Then came the war, and here before me stood an engineer, one of those who had replaced those destroyed. No one could deny him one point of superiority. He was much stronger, more visceral than those others had been. His shoulders and hands retained their strength even though they had not needed it for a long time. Freed from the restraints of courtesy, he stared sternly and spoke impersonally, as if he didn't even consider the possibility of a dissenting view. He had grown up differently from those others too, and he worked differently. His father had plowed the earth in the most literal sense. Lenya Zebra had been one of those disheveled, unenlightened peasant boys whose wasted talents so distressed Belinsky and Tolstoy. He was certainly no Lomonosov, and he could never have gotten to the academy on his own, but he was talented. If there had been no revolution, he would have plowed the land, and he would have become well-to-do because he was energetic and active. And he might have raised himself into the merchant class. It being the Soviet period, however, he entered the Komsomol, and his work in the Komsomol, overshadowing his other talents, lifted him out of anonymity, out of his lowly state, out of the countryside, and shot him like a rocket through the workers' school right into the industrial academy. He arrived there in 1929, at the very moment when those other engineers were being driven in whole herds into Gulag. It was urgently necessary for those in power to produce their own engineers politically conscious, loyal, 100%ers, who were to become bigwigs of production. Soviet businessmen, in fact, rather than people who did things themselves. That was the moment when the famous, commanding heights overlooking the as-yet uncreated industries were empty. And it was the fate of Zebra's class in the Industrial Academy to occupy them. Zebra's life became a chain of triumphs, and Zebra's life became a chain of triumphs, a garland winding right up to the peak. Those were the exhausting years from 1929 to 1933, when the Civil War was being waged, not as in 1918 to 1920, with tachankas, machine guns mounted on horse-drawn carts, but with police dogs, when the long lines of those dying of famine trudged towards the railroad stations in the hope of getting to the cities, which was where the bread grains were evidently ripening, but were refused tickets and were unable to leave, and lay dying beneath the station fences in a submissive human heap of homespun coats and bark shoes. In those same years, Zebra not only did not know that bread was rationed to city dwellers, but at a time when a manual laborer was receiving 60 rubles a month in wages, he enjoyed a student scholarship of 900 rubles a month. Zebra's heart did not ache for the countryside whose dust he had shaken from his feet. His new life was already soaring elsewhere among the victors and leaders. So this guy basically just got pumped up to, high Soviet status, and he was like the upper class, and everybody else was super poor. And he's living the high life, he likes it. Let's continue. He never had time to be an ordinary run-of-the-mill foreman. He was immediately assigned to a position in which he had dozens of engineers and thousands of workers under him. He was the chief engineer of the big construction projects outside of Moscow. From the very beginning of the war, he of course had an exemption from military service. He was evacuated to Alma-Ata together with the department he worked for, and in his area he bossed even bigger construction projects on the Ili River. But in this case, his workers were prisoners. The sight of those little gray people bothered him very little at the time, nor did it inspire him to any reprisals, nor compel him to take a closer look. In that gleaming orbit in which he circled, the only important thing was to achieve the projected totals, fulfillment of the plan. And it was quite enough for Zebra merely to punish a particular construction unit, a particular camp, and a particular work superintendent. After that, it was up to them to manage to fulfill their norm with their own resources. How many hours they had to work to do it, or what ration they had to get along. Sorry, guys. How many hours they had to work to do it, or what ration they had to get along on, were details that didn't concern him. The war years deep in the rear were the best years in Zebra's life. Such is the eternal and universal aspect of war. The more grief it accumulates at one of its poles, the more joy it generates at the other. Zebra had not only a bulldog's jaw, but also a swift, enterprising, business-like grasp. With the greatest skill, he immediately switched to the economy's new wartime rhythm. Everything for victory. Give and take, and the war will write it all off. He made just one small concession to the war. He got along without suits and neckties, and camouflaging himself in khaki color, had chrome leather boots made in order, and donned a general's tunic, the very one in which he appeared before us. That was fashionable and not uncommon at the time. It provoked neither anger in the war-wounded nor reproachful glances from women. Women usually looked at him with another sort of glance. They came to him to get well fed, to get warmed up, to have some fun. He had wild money passing through his hands. His billfold bulged like a little barrel with expense money, and to him 10-ruble notes were like kopecks, and thousands like single rubles. Zebra didn't hoard them, regret spending them, or keep count of them. He counted only the women who passed through his hands, and particularly those who he had, quote, uncorked, unquote. This count was his sport. In the cell, he assured us that his arrest had broken off the count at 290 plus, and he regretted that he had not reached 300, since it was wartime and the women were alone and lonely. This guy is pretty nasty. That's not in the text. That's my commentary. Continuing. And since, in addition to his power and money, he had the virility of a Rasputin, one can probably believe him, and he was quite prepared to describe one episode after another. It was just that our ears were not prepared to listen to him. Even though no danger threatened him, during those last years, he had frantically grabbed these women, messed them up, and then thrown them away like a greedy diner eating boiled crayfish, grabbing one, devouring it, sucking it, then grabbing the next. It's pretty nasty imagery right there, honestly. Anyway, he was so accustomed to the malleability of material to his own vigorous boar-like drive across the land. Whenever he was especially agitated, he would dash about the cell like a powerful boar who might just knock down an oak tree in his path. He was so accustomed to an environment in which all the leaders were his own kind of people, in which one could always make a deal, work things out, cover them up. He forgot that the more success one gains, the more envy one arouses. As he found out during his interrogation, a dossier had been accumulating against him since way back in 1936 on the basis of an anecdote he had carelessly told at a drunken party. More denunciations had followed and more testimony from agents. After all, one has to take women to restaurants where all types of people see you. Another report pointed out that he had been in no hurry to leave Moscow in 1941, that he had been waiting for the Germans. That's very bad. You don't want to wait for the Germans. You're supposed to be against the Germans. He had in actual fact stayed on longer than he should have, apparently because of some woman. Zebra took great care to keep his business deals clean, but he quite forgot the existence of Article 58. Nonetheless, the avalanche might not have overwhelmed him had he not grown overconfident and refused to supply building materials for a certain prosecutor's dacha. That was what caused his dormant case to awaken and tremble and start rolling. And this was one more instance of the fact that cases begin with the material self-interest of the Blue Boys. I just want to skip this next paragraph down to this highlighted section. We once discussed the whole course of the war with him, and I said from the very first moment I had never had any doubts about our victory over the Germans. He looked at me sharply. He did not believe me. "Come on, what are you saying?" And then he took his head in his hands. "Oh, Sasha, Sasha." And I was convinced the Germans would win. That's what did me in. There you are. He was one of the, quote, organizers of victory, end quote. But each day he believed in the German success and awaited their inevitable arrival. Not because he loved them, but simply because he had so sober an insight into our economy, which I, of course, knew nothing about and therefore believed in. So there's a lot to this story. First off, this guy seems like he wasn't really an actual engineer. He just went to the Komsomol, and because he, did his due diligence to the, Communist Party or whatever, he got promoted higher up and higher up. This is typically what happens in big government bureaucracy. People just on seniority and perceived accolade just kind of rise to the top. But this last quote is really interesting because, so this guy knows something, and that's why he gets put in the gulag so that he gets silenced because, well, it's a combination of things, but he knows something. Someone's jealous of him. Someone else denounces him. It doesn't matter whether or not the story's true. When you are denounced by somebody, you just go to the gulag. That's why, Solzhenitsyn says earlier, there's no such thing as guilt and innocence in our society, in the Soviet Union. But this is really interesting because Solzhenitsyn says, well, he was one of the, quote, organizers of victory, which is, the organizers of victory were supposed to be these high up, Soviet officials that were basically orchestrating everything so that not only was everything going to work out perfectly utopia in their own country, but also they were going to win every battle. And, it's basically a lie to keep, morale in the troops. But he had, this engineer, Zebra, had insight into the economy, which most of the soldiers, most everyone, didn't know anything about because the information was censored to such a big degree. So, the very people on the front line had no idea what was going on. And not only that, if you actually fought in the front line like Solzhenitsyn did and noticed that the Germans had an advantage, it was actually punishable if you were to talk about that advantage. You always had to basically lie to yourself and say, be all in for the Soviets. I thought that was a very interesting story, something for you guys to think about. Now I'm going to jump to, this is the last part that I'm going to read. And this is where Solzhenitsyn gets into, he starts talking about the relationship between what rights you actually had in Soviet Russia versus what actually happened, and how the interrogators and the interrogators' doctors and stuff like this, how they I want to say interpreted the rights, but really what it was it's important to disguise this from you as a prisoner, because if your rights were violated, the interrogator has an incentive to basically have successful interrogations, to meet their quota of people being imprisoned. If you question the criminal code, that could be considered counter-revolutionary behavior. So if somebody's rights are technically being deprived, it was not in your best interest as an interrogator to call attention to that, because not only could you get put in the gulag, but also you may not meet your quota, which could also put you in the gulag. So starting at this highlighted section, we put our teapot out in the corridor, and he poured straight into it from a pail without a spout, into the teapot and onto the runner and the floor beneath it, and the whole corridor was polished like that of a first-class hotel. And that was all they gave us. Whatever cooked food we got would be served at 1 p.m. and at 4 p.m., one meal almost on the heels of the other. You could then spend the next 21 hours remembering it. And that wasn't prison's brutality either. It was simply a matter of the kitchen staff having to do its work as quickly as possible and leave. At 9 o'clock in the morning, checkup took place. For a long while beforehand, we could hear especially loud turns of the keys and particularly sharp locks on the doors. Then one of the duty lieutenants for the whole floor would march forward and enter almost as erect as if he were standing at attention. He would take 2 steps forward and look sternly at us. We would be on our feet. We didn't even dare remember that political prisoners were once not required to rise. It was no work at all to count us. He could do it in a glance. But this was a moment for testing our rights. For we did have some rights after all, although we did not really know them, and it was his job to hide them from us. The whole strength of the Lubyanka training showed itself in a totally machine-like manner. No expression on the face, no inflection, not a superfluous word. And which of our rights did we know about? A request to have our shoes repaired. An appointment with the doctor. Although if they actually took you to the doctor, you would not be happy about the consequences. There, the machine-like Lubyanka manner would be particularly striking. He, the doctor, didn't ask, "What's your trouble?" That would take too many words, and one couldn't pronounce the phrase without any inflection. He would ask curtly, "Troubles?" And if you began to talk at too great length about your ailment, he would cut you off. It was clear anyway. A toothache? Extract it. You could have arsenic. A filling? We don't fill teeth here. That would have required additional appointments and created a somewhat humane atmosphere. The prison doctor was the interrogator and the executioner's right-hand man. The beaten prisoner would come to on the floor only to hear the doctor's voice. You can continue, the pulse is normal. After a prisoner's 5 days and nights in a punishment cell, the doctor inspects the frozen, naked body and says, "You can continue." If a prisoner is beaten to death, he signs the death certificate, cirrhosis of the liver, or coronary occlusion. He gets an urgent call to a dying prisoner in a cell, and he takes his time. And whoever behaves differently is not kept in the prison. How's that for universal health care? But our stoolie was better informed about his rights. Stoolie is a stool pigeon, is basically an informer that is still in the gulag. Like, they're still in prison in the gulag, but they decide to keep informing on people because they think that if they inform on enough people, they'll get taken out of the gulag sooner than everybody else, but they always stay in for the same amount of time, or someone ends up informing on them. Anyway, but our stoolie was better informed about his rights. According to him, he had already been under interrogation 11 months, and he was taken to interrogation only during the day. He spoke up and asked for an appointment with the prison chief. The chief of the whole Lubyanka? Yes. His name was taken down. And in the evening, after taps, when the interrogators were already in their offices, he was summoned. And he returned with some makorka, some food. This was very crude, of course, but so far they had not been able to think up anything better. It would have been a big expense to convert entirely to microphones in the walls and impossible to listen in on all the 111 cells for whole days at a time. Who would do it? Stool pigeons were cheaper and would continue to be used for a long time to come. So that's all I'm going to read for tonight. Wow, that's 41 minutes long. This is an incredibly long video. I apologize for that. But let me just discuss this last passage very quickly. So when I was streaming City Skylines, I mentioned something, which is that you as an individual need to decide what kind of person that you're going to be in these times. And I gave the example of, I believe it had something to do with the medical supply issue that's happening in Florida. Now, in order to not mince words too much on YouTube and stuff like that, let's make it related to this book that I'm reading. So let's say that the Supreme Soviet decides that this specific village is only going to get 50% of its ration of food, in preference to this other village that is receiving 100% of what's necessary, but maybe some important Soviet people in that area are complaining. All right. Let's think about what a stool pigeon would do. So the stool pigeon gets, there's an order that comes in that says we need to send 50 loaves of bread, just to pick an arbitrary number. We need to send 50 loaves of bread to City A. Now, what do you know about City A? Well, people are starving in City A. But the Soviet says, the Soviet commanders, they say, we're going to cut this in half and send it to City B. I need you, the stool pigeon, to mark down that we're cutting it in half, and you're going to package up 25 and send it to the starving village, and 25 and send it to the village that would be in surplus with 25. In fact, that extra 25 might just go bad because no one is going to be able to eat all of it. The stool pigeon signs it away. No problem, right? Just toes the line for the Soviet. And the point I was trying to make when I was playing City Skylines is when everybody does that, that's how you get the Gulag Archipelago. When people willingly just turn the blind eye to stuff like that, when they don't want to do the research, they act like they didn't know what happened, and then they get put in the Gulag, and they're like, I did everything right. I signed the papers. I interrogated this person. I denounced this person. I did all this stuff right. Like, why me? Why me? And that's, Solzhenitsyn talks about that a lot in this book. And he says, that's really the worst kind of person because, they're victims of their own system, and yet they still pledge allegiance to it when they end up in the Lubyanka. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about that for tonight. This was a way longer video than I expected. As usual, I'm going to try to keep these down in length so that you guys don't get bored. And obviously, we're going to play some more City Skylines, but I hope you guys have a good night. Thank you so much for watching. Again, this is EMPM. Excuse me, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Later.